you're on the live stream.
Good morning, everybody. The time is 10 o'clock. It's time for me to resume this public inquiry. As you all know, my name's Matthew Nunn. I'm the inspector that's been appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct the inquiry and to determine the appeal that is made by Catesby Strategic Land Limited relating to a site in Burnham Road, land off the Groves in Latchingdon. Just the usual reminders. If people could put their phones on silent mode, please, just to stop any disturbances. I haven't been advised that there's any fire alarm today, so I assume if the fire alarm goes, we need to evacuate the building. And as advised yesterday, I believe it's through this door here, we exit and assemble outside. Just to remind everyone again, I'm sure you're aware we're being live streamed for those who wish to watch proceedings online. I have no further particular points to raise apart from I was going to ask if there'd been any progress from the council side on the condition schedule. Mr. Wilcox.
So yes, my understanding is it's been sent to your case officer at Pins this morning. Right. I think we're at a point where they're entirely agreed, apart from two of them, where there are minor outstanding disputes for you to resolve. So
fine,
but otherwise they're in good shape, and we've got as far as we're going to get. Okay.
In terms of how we proceed this morning, we've effectively got two witnesses to hear, haven't we? We've got Mr. Milcreast and Mr. Armstrong. In terms of time estimates, I think Mr. Cannock, you initially said you'd be about 45 minutes in chief with each.
I think that's about right, sir, yes.
Yeah, and Mr. Wilcox, do you know roughly how long you might be in Cross?
Sir, I think I will be between 30 and 45 minutes with Mr. Milcreast, and I'd have thought between 75 and 90 minutes with Mr. Armstrong. I'm taking the view, sir, that you'll have the council's case from Mr. Coleman's answers yesterday. I expect you have the appellant's case from my learned friend's questions yesterday. So rather than going over a lot of territory that you'll already be familiar with, so I'm going to be quite focused.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you very much, Mr. Wilcox, for that. That means we should get through the evidence, I would hope, reasonably speedily then this morning. In terms of the overall programme of the inquiry, I obviously need to undertake a site visit. My view is that it may well be possible for me to do that unaccompanied. I obviously seek both your views on that. Does anyone, Mr. Cannock, any views on that?
No, I've taken instructions. We discussed it last night, sir. We don't see a need for you to be accompanied. We'll discuss the zone of visual influence in a little while, and you can see the viewpoints, and they're set out quite clearly in the appendices to Mr. Milcreast. So no, doesn't need to be accompanied as far as we are concerned. You have permission to go on site. I think it would be helpful, respectfully, for you to go on site and to look back at the settlement, but I don't think it's necessary for you to walk the entirety of the site. I think you'll get a flavour from the north and the southern fields. I think our just one sort of note of caution, we're going to look at the viewpoints of photo montages. They are actually on a road, and we wouldn't encourage you to be standing there with the photo montages out.
No.
You use those as a desk-based tool, but if you were to drive, because that after all is the experience that people have, and that's our only note of caution. But I'm not going to tell you how to suck eggs and to take a site visit, so you'll be more than capable of doing it.
We won't. We're always instructed not to, take risks, as it were. Mr. Wilcox.
So I agree with Mr. Cannock. So it's not the kind of site or the kind of dispute where I think you're going to need to be shown where to look at it from, or where there are going to be any challenges around orientation. So from our perspective, so I'm very happy for you to do it unaccompanied.
I mean, if either side wants to or if you want to agree a route or certain viewpoints that you think I should view the site from, if you want to work together on a sort of an approved route for me to do, then might be helpful from my perspective.
Well, perhaps so. Once Mr. Milcreast is done with his evidence, perhaps he and Mr. Coleman can have a discussion about that and come up with a plan for you.
Yes, I think that would be helpful. That would be helpful. And given the weather forecast, which I gather is not necessarily very good over the next few days, it does make sense for me to do it unaccompanied. Then it means I can do it at an appropriate time when the weather conditions are good, as it were, rather than arranging a visit and it's pouring with rain or we've got gale force winds, as we seem to have had the last couple of days. All right, good. Are there any other procedural points anyone wants to raise at this stage?
Just one, sir, if I may. I think we'll probably come on to the Section 106 briefly tomorrow morning. I just, again, don't need an answer now, but whether you think it might be necessary for my instructing solicitor to turn up and attend. As I said in opening, there's nothing controversial between the two of us. No third parties or local residents have raised any issues. I'll be honest with you, it's just a point of cost and convenience that if you've no particular points or issues to understand, then we probably wouldn't have him here. But of course he can be. So if you could let us know by the end of today, that would be very helpful. Thank you. No,
what I will do is I'll have another look at the obligation, and I mean, if it's fairly straightforward, it may well be that we don't need a solicitor here from your side. I wonder is it possible for me to have a paper version of the latest draft? That would assist me. If that could be provided, I don't know whether the council or not necessarily this minute, but
and maybe a list
in
of
due course, that would be helpful.
Do you want a hard copy of the conditions as well?
Indeed, that would also be helpful if they're ready for to be distributed.
We'll get that done for you.
I mean, it doesn't have to be done this minute, but those are two things that would be very helpful: paper copy of conditions and obligation. Right, and I'll have as I say, I'll have a look at the obligation again, Mr. Cannock, and it may well be we don't need the solicitor. So, but I'll let you know by close of play today. All right. Anything from your side, Mr.
Just to mention, so you should, I hope, have had the seal compliance statement by this point as well.
Right. Has that been emailed to the?
I believe it was emailed last night. Yeah.
Right.
I certainly asked for it to be.
Okay. There's sometimes a bit of a delay in things finding their way to me. I'll check that.
Well, perhaps so when we're doing hard copies, I'll print you one of those as well. So you can have it from us this way.
That's fine. That's fine. All right. Good. Unless there's any other procedural points, then we'll get on to the evidence. And Mr. Milcreast.
Thank you, sir. And all you will need is the proof and appendices of Mr. Milcreast and the statement of common ground, and I think core document 3.1, which is the plan.
Okay.
So, Mr. Milcreast, let me introduce you. Your name is Charles Milcreast, is that correct?
That's correct.
You're a director of EDP. You provide advice as a chartered landscape architect and environmental planner, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Your qualifications include a BA Honours degree in landscape architecture from the University of Gloucestershire and a postgraduate diploma in the same subject. You've been a fully chartered member of the Landscape Institute since 2006, and you're an associate member of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
You possess more than 20 years' experience in professional practice, first as a landscape consultant for Halcrow, and subsequently from 2005 to 2011 as a project landscape architect at the Derek Lovejoy Partnership in Birmingham. You joined EDP in March 2011, where your role progressed to discipline lead for the landscape team, and you were appointed as our director in 2018. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
I won't embarrass you by reading all of your experience, but you tell us at 1.7 that the evidence you prepared is true to the best of your knowledge and belief. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And we also just note at 1.8 of your evidence that you were instructed in 2021, and since then you have provided landscape advice to the applicant from the outset of the design process, and you authored the landscape and visual impact appraisal. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to take all of that as read, Mr. Milcreast, if I may, and ask you to start at 3.4. And I'm not going to ask you to read this out, and the inspector's indicated that he's read it and understood it. But if you could just turn to your 3.4 and also turn to EDP1, which is the illustrative master plan, and just explain in your own words what you say the important characteristics of the site are.
Thank you. So the site is typical of the local area. It's a rectilinear agricultural field parcel, or actually part of two fields. It sits at a low level, approximately 10 metres above AOD, and directly adjacent to the eastern side of Latchingdon village. The fields are currently, or certainly when I've visited the site, put over to arable cropping, and they're compartmentalised by hedgerows along the eastern boundary, some of which are fragmented and do not extend the full length of the eastern site boundary. In essence, we would be making a new site boundary in that location. To the east, one of the main influencing factors really of the site in general is the settlement edge. To the west of the northern field parcel, we've got there's an area of residential housing on Lawlinge Road, which I believe is from around the 1960s. And then further south, adjacent to the southern field parcel, there's a much more contemporary development of more modern housing, which directly abuts the field parcel. As I noted earlier, the site is very characteristic of the wider Dengie Peninsula, which comprises, as Mr. Coleman discussed yesterday, large areas of agricultural farmland with rectilinear roads and rectilinear field parcels. So in terms of the main influences over the site, as I mentioned, it's the influence that the neighbouring residential areas provide. It's a settlement edge in that respect, quite clearly. The rectilinear nature of the site is also characteristic and quite prominent. And due to the flat topography, there's definitely a sense of foreshortened views in terms of the wider visual impact. And what I mean by that is that the vertical elements within the wider landscape have more of an influence than they might do in restricting visibility of the site and correspondingly the settlement from the east.
And on that point, if you just turn to 3.12 and you discuss there the theoretical zone of visual influence, a concept with which the inspector will be very familiar. Can you turn please to CM5? So I have that on page 39 of your appendices. And could you just explain what the theoretical zone of influence is of the site?
Indeed. So what this plan shows as a yellow wash is the area we termed zone of primary visibility, which is the area within which the proposals would be most visible within the surrounding landscape. It's not the only place they might be visible, but is the primary area where they would be visible. As you can see, certainly for a site of this scale, it does present a very limited area, predominantly within 1 kilometre. And the reason for that is almost entirely due to the flat nature of the site and the corresponding screening that's provided by both the existing settlement of Latchingdon, which screens views from the west, and intervening features such as farmsteads, trees, hedgerows, etc., which restricts visibility to the east. To the northeast, you can see viewpoint 8. That sits on a slightly elevated piece of topography near Lawling Hall, and that's one of the relatively rare elevated points in the surrounding landscape from where you'll be able to or where you can see Latchingdon in a slightly different setting.
Yeah, and so it's probably not for me to say, but it might be that this is a good starter for the site visit itinerary. But just trying to understand this then, because previously your analysis mentioned about the absence of public rights of way across the site, etc. So from where, if anywhere, does one appreciate the identity of the settlement of Latchingdon? Which of these viewpoints?
So the principal viewpoints which represent transient views along the local roads, so Steeple Road and Burnham Road, viewpoints 1 to 4, and viewpoints 6 and 8. Primarily 1 to 4 and 6, where when you drive towards the settlement edge comes into view when you're relatively close to it. There are glimpses of it further afield, and that is really the limit of where you experience the settlement in its landscape context.
Okay, so it's as you experience it on the roads approaching, and I think that explains why you've taken the photo montages from those locations. Is that right?
Yeah, indeed. Those are the few views where you will experience that change in context, and we've attempted with the photo montages. I've attempted with the photo montages to illustrate the worst case change. And it's also notable just the limitation in public rights of way. There's evidently a good network of public rights of way to the west of the village, which go south from the street up towards the higher ground. But to the east of the settlement, there's a real paucity of rights of way, which is, in my experience, relatively unusual for an area of rural England.
The next thing then is to look at the development of the landscape strategy. Could you turn to your page 14 and paragraph 4.8? And could you also then, so 4.8, page 14, but also plan EDP2, which is the landscape strategy plan?
Sorry, no, it's actually appendix EDP2.
Yes, correct. Yeah. And again, we've got this down in writing and we've got it in front of us here and it's annotated, and respectfully, I think we can all follow the plan. But do you want to just give us the edited highlights, but concentrating, please, on the approaches that we've looked at, what the design response has been to the approaches from where you will experience the site.
So the landscape strategy shown on my appendix CDP2, and that was conceived throughout the design evolution of the site. Initially, there were two larger blocks of development, north and south, and in response to our advice, that was the western buffer, if we can call it the Eastern Green Buffer, has been enhanced considerably since the initial concept schemes concept plans were developed. And that's really in response to the existing settlement edge of Latchingdon, which provides a somewhat fragmented, disorganised character. And that's largely due to the different ages of residential dwellings along that boundary. And there was a real opportunity here to use what is a considerable part of the appeal site to provide an extensive area of public open space, extensive areas of planting, which provide obviously huge amounts of biodiversity net gain, and in doing so, allow views from the east to be, I won't say entirely screened, but the views of the development beyond that eastern landscape buffer would present a much softer integration into the wider landscape. Just in terms of numbers, I just do want to clarify that in my proof there are two references to numbers of trees. One states approximately 474 trees and the other one states 747. I just wanted to confirm the number in the conclusion, which is 474, is the correct number.
Okay.
Do you want to just strike out the one that's incorrect? Which page would that be?
Okay. Sorry, bear with me. So on page 23 of my proof, sir,
23.
The first bullet under paragraph 6.6.
And the change we're making is?
To 474.
Sorry, so the first bullet under 6.6 should be 474.
Yes, so not instead of 747.
Yeah,
So a bit of numerical
yes, that's fine.
incorrectness there. Apologies for
Okay,
that.
no, that's absolutely fine.
And the other reference is within the summary.
And that's correct.
That is correct. Yes.
Thank you.
And if I then just think about that viewpoint that we looked at from Steeple Road, then what I see in the north eastern portion is an area of woodland. So what effect will that have on assimilating the development and screening impacts from the approaches along Steeple Road?
So the reason for the woodland just in the first instance was there were two primary reasons for that. The first one being, as you point out, the ability of that piece of woodland to provide a soft integration and further screening as you approach the settlement from the east. And it's also reflecting one of the key characteristics within the Essex Landscape Character Assessment, which is for small areas of woodland.
Okay, and then just give me an idea, if I'm then looking at the what you call the southern parcel, and I'm approaching then from the east on Burnham Road, and I'm looking back across the site, and if I look sort of the area of the allotments, what I see just above the allotments is, and obviously this is illustrative, but I see some perimeter planting, a horseshoe of planting, some planting, what looks then to be an informal path, and another row of planting, and then a road, and then I see the first elevation of the houses. What's the distance from that sort of the front elevation of that house to the eastern boundary?
So the front elevation of which house? Sorry,
Well, I don't know if people can see. I'm sort of just trying to understand what the distance is from there to there, if people can see that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm using the scale bar. It's approximately. It's approximately 60 metres.
60 metres. And so an area of 60 metres in which one could have structural landscaping, what impact is that going to have on assimilating and addressing views as one approaches from Burnham Road then to the south?
It's as really shown on the photo montages, which we'll obviously take a look at a bit later on. The first principles of landscape strategy were to retain existing vegetation, so where that was available and where that was possible. So that includes the eastern boundary and also the hedgerow through the middle of the two, or in between the north and south development parcels. The benefit we have with this proposal and the space provided is that we are able to have a line of hedgerow with hedgerow trees along the eastern boundary, and then different layers of vegetation between that hedgerow and then the first houses. And that would include, as I say, the hedgerow, planting around the sustainable drainage basins and the play area, further planting along the rights of way, and then an additional hedgerow and planting along the frontage of the residential units.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll take these matters briefly. 412 then, what was the position of officers and in particular the case officer about the nature of the design and the landscape strategy at the point of determination?
Effectively, the landscape strategy and the general landscape and visual impact were not really in dispute within the committee report, and the officer made some fairly detailed analysis against the Malden District Design Guide, and ultimately concluding that the proposals responded very positively to that, both in terms of the amount of green infrastructure and planting, but also in terms of the development density and the requirement within the design guide for having lesser dense development on the eastern edge.
Next, please, your page 23, 6.7. So page 23, and we have table EDP 6.1, and you set out the landscape effects in summary on the site, the immediate surroundings, and then the coastal farmland LCA. Do you see that?
I do.
And if you then turn over the page to to page 27 and 624, the summary of the visual impacts are that they would be localized and limited. Do you see that?
I do.
And it says there's sufficient layering of vegetation within the surrounding flat landscape to ensure the extensiveness of visual change would be limited to a limited number of local receptors. Okay, so that was the analysis. If you turn please to 2.2, so then at the point of determination, what, if any, criticism had there been of that landscape and visual assessment?
There had been absolutely no comment or criticism at that point. It was notable there was no response from any landscape officers within the council to the application from a landscape perspective. And ultimately, the consideration of the scheme within the report to committee at 4.6.1 was incredibly brief and really summarised in a very similar fashion the extent of effects that we have and I did in the LVIA.
What, if one looks just at 2.1, what reference is there, if any, to character and appearance or identity of Latchingdon in the reason for refusal?
There is no reference to that.
If you turn please to your 3.2 and 3.3, so page 8, I mean briefly, you're saying there that the site's not designated, has no statutory status or identified quality, it's not valued, no listed buildings in the site, no conservation areas or scheduled monuments. You reference the pillbox, you refer to ecological designations and the TPO. I think, in fact, we see these marked on plan CM3 on page 37. But just briefly, how constrained in landscape and visual terms is the site?
Really, as set out at 3.2, the site is incredibly unconstrained in landscape and visual terms, and in fact in environmental terms. And the conclusion I must draw from the lack of requirement for the council to seek any further professional advice or opinion to inform the decision leads me to believe that the same view was taken in terms of the lack of technical and designatory constraint. Obviously, that's not to say that the site doesn't have any value. All landscapes have some value, but it provides a very useful context to start understanding how high up the sort of value scale, if you like, a site sits.
Next, please, could you pick up the statement of common ground at 8.23? So CD 9.3, statement of common ground, paragraph 8.23. And we note at 8.23, so in the light of that, the landscape impacts and those visual impacts, there's no objection raised by the local authority on landscape grounds. It's agreed that any landscape effects are likely to be limited and localised as set out in the LVIA. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
Any dispute that there can be high quality design delivered at reserve matters stage?
No.
Is there, what's the agreed position on impact on residential amenity?
It's agreed that there's no impact on residential amenity.
Okay, so this leaves then the point raised in Mr. Coleman's evidence about policy S112. So could you just turn to that, please? So CD 3.1. page 18 of the PDF, policy S112. And what that's telling us is to maintain the rural character of the district without compromising the identity of its individual settlements. If I deal with the first part, maintain the rural character of the district. Well, to what extent, if at all, is that a landscape point?
I think, yeah, it is a landscape point. I would consider rural character to be the same really as the impact upon landscape character, on published landscape character. And in this respect, there is clear agreement that the impacts of this proposal are limited and localised. And I would completely maintain that the character of the wider district, on the basis of such localised landscape impacts, would be maintained.
Okay. Is there any technical competing assessment from a competent professional to your analysis?
No, there isn't.
So if we then look at the next part, without compromising the identity of its individual settlements, we've agreed with Mr. Coleman that this is not a no harm policy. It's not a no change policy. It requires the exercise of a professional judgment. How do you say one should exercise a professional judgment to reach a conclusion on whether the identity of Latchingdon has been unacceptably compromised?
The way I look at this is very similar to how one assesses impacts upon landscape character. In that respect, we most of the time have a landscape character assessment to provide us with an evidence base which provides a baseline of the landscape character and typically provides a list of key characteristics against which we would then assess the proposals. And I consider it's very similar, if not exactly the same, for considering issues around identity. One needs to understand what the identity is to then understand how and if the proposals impact that identity.
And so if you turn please to your 6.30 of your evidence. It's there that you address what is the current identity of Latchingdon, and if you turn to the top of page 29, could you just briefly explain then what you say is the current identity of Latchingdon?
So in the first instance, I've looked at how the settlement sits within its wider context, so within the wider landscape, and not the detail of the internals of the settlement, which I can move on to. From the higher level, and as Mr. Coleman touched on yesterday, it's a small to medium village in a wider agricultural landscape. And if we can just make reference to my proof plan CM1, which is on page 35. Sorry, my proof plan CM1, no, it's at the back of my main text. Sorry for the slide.
What page?
35. So from that, again, it's the same plan I think Mr. Coleman drew reference to yesterday. There are a number of other settlements within the wider landscape, so Mayland, Althorne, Latchingdon, and even Cold Norton, which have a broadly similar character in terms of being on the intersections of roads and being in part defined by the sort of rectilinear landscape character that exists in this area. And what I think you can see from this plan is that Latchingdon, and indeed those other settlements, are not what I would consider truly linear. They're broadly linear in the sense that they are located along roads, or certainly started as settlements that are located along roads, but then have grown over the last 100 years or so into more of a mixture of linear and nucleated form as the requirements have been for growth in those small settlements.
Okay. And if you just look at the next one, CM2 on page 36. What evidence do we see currently of cul-de-sacs in and around the vicinity of the site?
So it's clear the original linear core or linear heart of the settlement has it still remains. It still remains in and around the church and the school, but I think since about the 1960s there has been a number of areas of growth. You can see just to the right of the number 3 on that plan, Lawlange Road, which is a more nucleated extension out from Burnham Road. Similarly to the north at, I believe it is Ramsey Close in Meadow Way. There's another close stroke cul-de-sac there. And then more recently, there are the developments immediately to the west of the appeal site and on the other side of Burnham Road, north of the Bowl Centre. That's not actually shown on this plan, but Mr. Coleman's plan in his proof, which we referred to yesterday, shows that area now obviously partially built out, if not completely built out. The point being that the settlement has organically moved away from the truly linear and now contains almost more characteristic nucleated forms off that central road.
But what is there, if anything, of any intrinsic landscape or townscape merit in a linear as distinct from a nucleated settlement?
Nothing specific. They are both types of settlement form, both have their qualities, and clearly as Latchingdon has grown, both have their qualities within Latchingdon as well.
And so if you then look at your next point, your 632, please. Sorry, just before I go there, what then, if anything, is the relevance of scale to the existing identity?
In the same way as building style, presence of green space, scale is one part of the wider makeup of the identity of anywhere, of a settlement or a town. Indeed, I think when you have settlements of the type of Latchingdon, where they historically run along a road, you actually get a sense of a slightly larger scale because you experience the settlement for slightly longer than you would if it was a truly nucleated settlement.
And so an arithmetical comparison of numbers of households at different points in time, and or a comparison in 2 dimensions of site coverage, how useful do you say that is as an exercise in trying to understand the existing identity of a settlement and or what the impact of the identity will be?
It's not particularly helpful in defining character and identity. In the same way, I draw a comparison to landscape character effects. Although site size and scale is a relevant factor, it's more about the threshold of the receptor to receive the change that is proposed.
So next, please, if you then turn to your 632, could you just briefly explain what you say then the impact is on the identity of Latchingdon?
So from a wider sense, there will be a change to the eastern edge of the settlement as it's experienced from areas to the east, particularly from Steeple Road and Burnham Road. There will be a new settlement edge, quite clearly. in my professional opinion, the proposed settlement edge that could be created courtesy of the significant western landscape buffer that's proposed would actually improve that relationship with its agricultural hinterland. It certainly wouldn't fundamentally change that relationship. There would still be agricultural land on the edge of Latchingdon village. In terms of the value to those features of the settlement more internally, so the historic core, the listed buildings, I think it's an agreed matter that there are no unacceptable impacts to the church or other listed buildings. And similarly, Mr. Coleman mentioned yesterday the views of the church from the wider landscape. Those views would, by and large, remain intact. There would still be views of the church as you drive and walk around the local area, particularly to the east, where we would be having an impact.
So finally then, let's just look at the photo montages, because I want to try and understand, as it were, from where one might experience any change to the identity of the settlement. And I think we'll start then, please, in the landscape appendices with EDP 8, which I have at page 14 at the top right-hand corner.
Do you have a page number?
Yes, page 14, sir.
14.
Of the hard copy, yeah. It'll be a different page of the electronic copy.
So it's photo viewpoint EDP8. And so you'll recall, if you want to have this to hand with, was it CM4 or CM5 rather, then you can see where these viewpoints are. We're to the northwest at just near Lawling Hall on a public right-of-way. How, if at all, sorry, we obviously see Latchingdon here. What experience does one have of Latchingdon?
So just to put this view into context, this is one of the relatively few areas of elevated ground within the local area from where views of Latchingdon are available. You can clearly see Latchingdon in I'd say in the middle distance. You can see the eastern edge of the settlement, and then looking further right towards I presume is a horse shed, you can see the church as a feature identifying the core of the village. In essence, what you see, although it is partially screened by a hedgerow in the foreground, is the presence of a village within a wider agricultural landscape.
And
This is a public footpath.
Yes,
point,
it is, sir.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
So this is the view you would get from the public right of way.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah.
So viewpoint 8 on my plans. Yeah.
And in terms of the visible part of the settlement that I can see, what part of it is it that I can see?
It's fairly in the distance, but you can see the eastern edge of the village. You can see the new houses adjacent to the appeal site's southern field parcel, and then extending to the right towards the church. Slightly less visible is the remaining edge of the village.
So what I can see effectively is the rear of what you're saying, a 1960s housing off Lawlinge, and then the more modern housing adjacent to the southern parcel.
Yeah, and actually there, which you'll see on site when you undertake your site visit, sir, the more contemporary housing adjacent to the appeal site's southern parcel provides quite a stark relationship to the appeal site, in the sense there's very little landscape buffering between those houses and the site.
As experience from this, one of the few available viewpoints, will there be any change to your experience to the identity of settlement, or any unacceptable harm to the identity of Latchingdon?
In my view, I just can't see how the extension of the eastern settlement edge around about 120 metres to the east with the proposed landscape mitigation, which would provide a much softer integration with its transition into the agricultural landscape, the overall identity of Latchingdon just, in my view, wouldn't change. It would still represent a settlement within a wider agricultural landscape. And for some views, particularly this view, I believe, in the longer term, it would be even less visible than it is now.
Next, please, if you could turn to, again, in the landscape appendices, page 30, viewpoint 4. So this is on the approach from Steeple Road. This is the existing view.
Sorry, Mr. Cannon.
Yeah, page 30, sir.
30, on the big...
Yes. Viewpoint 4, existing baseline view.
The one with the left end side.
Yes, correct. And again, so we can note the presence of the steeple. And what do you want to say then again as to what is it that we're looking at, which is giving some impression as to the identity of the settlement as experienced from this viewpoint?
What we're seeing immediately in the foreground is the characteristic agricultural arable landscape. Beyond that, you have a varied settlement edge to Latchingdon. To the left-hand side of that settlement edge, you can see the more contemporary housing adjacent to the appeal site southern field parcel, and then extending to the right, you have the eastern settlement boundary extending all the way up to the church, which again marks the core of the village.
And just so that the inspector can understand, this is what you are describing as the relatively raw settlement edge, where we're looking at the sides and rears of essentially modern suburban housing. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Then over the page, and we understand that this isn't a VVI, this is just a blocking sort of tool, but we see the proposal, raw and unfiltered. And then if one turns over the page again to see the effect with the structured landscaping. So comparing this with the year at 15, let's just understand some of the assumptions that you've made. This is a winter view, is that correct?
Yeah, this is correct. That's correct. It was taken in December 2023.
Mr. Fitzgerald, I think it was yesterday, who was concerned about the characteristic view back to the church and the spire. Will there be any impact to that view back to the church or the spire?
No. The part of the site.
You're welcome to look at these if you're struggling to follow. No, okay.
So yes, the view of the church spire remains, identifying the core of the village.
Yeah. Okay, because as a matter of unanswerable fact, the housing is not in between the viewer and the spire.
No, it's not.
And then in terms of assumptions that you've made about landscaping, what height would the trees be put in at?
The trees would be put in at heights of up to 4.5 metres. There would obviously typically be a variety of heights, but we would, from a landscape design perspective, look to put a larger stock in the areas where you can get slightly more immediate impact. And then they are shown at year 15 at between 10 and 15 metres, using a relatively unoptimistic growth rate of 200 to 250 millimetres per year, which is very standard in terms of providing images such as this.
So a conservative assumption, I think, is what you're saying.
Indeed.
And the eaves heights are assumed to be what?
The eaves of the larger properties, so the two-storey properties would be 6 metres, and the bungalows would be 3 metres.
So what this is showing then is trees at approximately 10 metres.
10 to 15
We've
metres.
then got 50 or 60 metres before the housing at an eaves height of 6 metres. And so the overall effect of that substantial area, because here we're looking through the woodland planting and then the structured planting further along, what's the overall impact relative to what we're looking at the moment?
In my view, it's an improvement in the sense there's a much softer integration between the settlement and the wider landscape, and actually a much more uniform spread across the view in terms of how the settlement is perceived.
Any impact or any unacceptable impact on the identity of Latchingdon?
Again, in my view, insofar as it contributes to the identity is relatively unchanged, and in some ways it's improved.
How, if at all, can one understand the linearity, if indeed it is linear anymore, the linearity of Latchingdon? Do you appreciate that it's linear in this viewpoint?
No, and the extent to which you would appreciate it is linear would be exactly the same in the before and after view.
And then if one looks at viewpoint 6 then on the approach from Burnham Road, and we're just going to go briefly through a similar exercise. Again, don't want to tell the inspector how to suck eggs, but what we see then from the south, we've got the existing baseline view. We see the raw settlement edge of the modern housing. Is that correct?
Yes, you can see beyond the property known, I think, as the Groves. You can see the new housing beyond that, and this is just one part of a transient view. This is, as you go further down Burnham Road, you'll actually see more of the contemporary housing and less of the other housing to the north. But you can see it spreads across most of the view, with the church visible by the large evergreen tree in the middle of the view.
Over the page, we see the blocking exercise without planting. And then if one looks at the position at year 15, what, if anything, do you say about the impact on the identity of Latchingdon from this viewpoint?
In terms of the overall identity of a settlement, as perceived from the wider landscape, of a settlement within an agricultural landscape, that hasn't changed. Evidently, the settlement has moved closer to the viewer at this point. But the overall character, if you like, in terms of a settlement fronting onto agricultural landscape remains, and will be, again, as for the other viewpoints, a more uniform character across the view due to the potential provided by that western buffer, which provides that potential to plant native species in a very consistent and planned manner.
And if one is concerned with how the identity of Latchingdon is experienced on its approaches from the east, which is more successful in having a transition from built form to open countryside, the existing raw unfiltered modern housing, or what is proposed?
In my view as a landscape architect, it's definitely the proposals in place, because you have that soft integration which you just don't currently have.
Thank you, sir. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cannock. Just on the just a quick query from my part.
Yes, sir.
In terms of the landscape buffer, you mentioned just now that it will be proposed to have sort of native type species. What sort of planting? I'm sure it's set out in the landscape strategy, but what kind of planting were you proposing there?
So if we just refer to the appendix CDP2,
I've got the
the landscape strategy plan.
Yes.
Ultimately, so that is for detailed determination at the reserve matters stage, but inevitably we would be typically requested to provide native hedgerow planting, native tree planting, so maples, the typical native British trees, some of which grow faster than others, which we've tried to accommodate in terms of the mitigation appearance in the photomontages. Typically the hedgerows nearer the housing would be better controlled or clipped down to be more easily managed, whereas the eastern boundary hedgerow could be allowed to grow out to provide a greater level of screening if that was so desired. It might be that the level of planting is something to be discussed and negotiated at reserve matter stage if, for example, a greater view of built development was required. The exercise of producing both the landscape plan, but more importantly the montages, was to demonstrate or to reinforce my views of the effectiveness of that mitigation.
Thank you. This may not be a question for you, actually, Mr. Milcreast. It may be one for the planning witness, Mr. Armstrong. But as things currently stand, as I understand it, this is an outline application. With the only matter that is being approved at this stage is access, means of access. And as I think Mr. Cannock, you made clear in your opening or earlier yesterday, we're not concerned with the internal road layout.
Correct.
I'm just wondering, you've obviously emphasised the importance of the sort of softening edge, as it were, proposed by this layout. I'm just wondering how it's proposed that would actually be secured in any planning permission. I haven't seen the latest version of the condition, so I don't know if there's one of the conditions says something to the effect of, development shall be in general accordance with plan, ED, whatever. Or I don't know if that's the way. It may be Mr. Armstrong is better placed to answer that.
Mr. Armstrong is better placed, but I would say it could not. Yes, it can be controlled through. I'm sure the distance and the extent of that that landscape buffer could be controlled in some manner at the next stage.
It seems to me that obviously I've heard your examination in chief, and you make a lot of you place great emphasis on the fact that there would be this buffer essentially on the eastern side that would create a much softer edge, and I'm just wondering. I mean, it's maybe something for Mr. Armstrong and to answer the question whether the condition would be worded in such a way to ensure that the layout, in the event if we did proceed with the development, that could be enshrined in any proposal, because it seems to me if it doesn't have any kind of, if there's no mechanism for doing that, you could end up with houses right up to the edge of the field, which would be quite, I mean, even looking at the illustrative photo montages, at year one, they look pretty intrusive. I understand that over a period of time it would be shielded if it were to go ahead, but something maybe for Mr. Armstrong. I
think something we can certainly consider, and Mr. Armstrong can perhaps confirm later on. I understand what the point you're making on the year one photo montage. I would just confirm that, as Mr. Cannock did, that they are effectively block, and they don't provide any finishes in terms of materiality and that kind of thing, which would obviously soften their view. They wouldn't be constructed exactly as shown, obviously. I'm sure
I
appreciate that. It was
I
more,
appreciate that.
Yeah.
I mean, it is an outline application,
yes.
So all matters apart from access are reserved matters, effectively. So that would be for the council to deal with in due course. As I say, if I were minded to allow the appeal. But yeah, no, I was more concerned about the overall layout, really, and how that would be secured, to ensure this buffer.
Yeah.
Did you want to come in, Mr. Wilcox?
I was just going to, it may assist, one of the, it's condition 3, I think, in the draft, which has made its way to you, requires landscaping details, including soft landscaping, to be agreed in writing with the LPA at reserve matter stage. So there is something in the conditions that deals with it. Whether it deals with it to the extent that you're interested in is perhaps a discussion best had at the round table.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder whether it's something that could be potentially... I appreciate, Mr. Cannock, you might need to take instructions on this anyway. So, but I'm just wondering, it would at least establish a kind of broad framework as to how the development might proceed, rather than just leaving it completely open to, any future developer to build in a way that doesn't ensure that buffer.
In a similar way to EIA, you'd have a parameter plan, which would control this kind of
I mean, parameter, yes. I mean, that's right. I don't know. Again, I haven't. I have got the conditions now. They've been sent to me, but I haven't had a chance to look at them. I don't know. Is there, Mr. Wilcox? Is there anything about a parameter plan, for example, in the first condition?
I'm just having a look now, sir.
So I don't think there is. I think I
Okay,
think from
this is probably
from,
something that we
Yes.
we need to discuss all in the condition session. But it does seem to me that it might something that needs to be given some thought to as to whether there could be some way of tying the development down slightly more.
in accordance with the illustrative master plan and the landscape strategy.
Indeed, I mean, this isn't an unusual approach. I've had it many times where it's been agreed that can occur. Otherwise, everything you've said this morning is, to some extent, it's neither here nor there. If the condition, if there's no condition to secure that.
I understand that, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. So that we've heard your in chief. I'm wondering whether it might be a good time just to have a short break.
I'm very happy to do so, sir. I'm regretting that huge amount of tea. So short break might be leisure.
It does look pretty big, indeed. Let's have a we'll have a 20-minute break. So we'll come back at 11:20, and we'll resume the cross-examination. Thank you very much.
are now live again.
Well, good morning, everybody. We'll resume the public inquiry. We're at the point now where Mr. Wilcox will cross-examine Mr. Milcreast. So I'll let you proceed, Mr. Wilcox.
So thank you very much, Mr. Milcreast. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
As you're aware, there's no landscape and visual objection as such from the council, so I won't be asking you any detailed questions about the L&V component, as it were. We won't need to trouble our Glivia 3s. I'm sure we'll all be pleased to hear.
Always good.
But what I'd like to begin with is the nature of the issue between the parties, in particular in respect of policy S1. So if we can just take up, please, core document 3.1, page 15. And we're just going to remind ourselves of what key principle 12 has to say. And we see that it's concerned with broadly two things. It's concerned with maintenance of rural character, and it's concerned with compromising, or not compromising, one should say, the identity of the individual settlements. Yes?
Indeed. Yeah.
Now, you indicated in chief, Mr. Milcreast, your view that rural character here is essentially analogous with landscape character. Is that fair?
In essence, yes. It can the rural character, I'd say, the countryside character, landscape character. It's broadly the same issue.
So you've approached this policy on the basis they're synonymous, effectively.
Agreed. Yes.
Right. One of the difficulties with that, Mr. Milcreast, is that we know that when the local plan means landscape, it says landscape, doesn't it?
Yes.
S8, for instance, refers specifically to landscape issues when landscape issues are live. Aware of that?
Yes, indeed. Yes. S8.
You're aware that the development plan had a landscape and visual impact assessment prepared in association with it?
I believe so. I wasn't 100% aware of that, but yes, I believe.
I promise you
If
we
you're
did,
saying
and a
yes.
number of occasions within the plan where landscape and visual issues are going to be central to the application of the policy. It's identified as one of the key evidence documents. You aware of that?
Yes. Agreed.
If we go down to the bottom of page 16, paragraph 2.10 of CD 3.1, we see the key evidence-based documents for S1, and what we don't see here is the LVIA, do we?
No, we don't.
We can go, please, to page 45 within the same document. We find policy S8.
Sorry. Okay.
And once again, if we just go a couple of pages down, 2.104, key evidence-based documents. Once again, we don't see the LVIA there, do we?
No.
So, insofar as rural character is a matter for consideration, the authors of this plan didn't regard that as sufficiently landscape linked to make the LVIA a key document.
It's not referenced under those two policies, no.
Now, I appreciate that what policy means, of course, is a matter of interpretation and thus a question for submission rather than for evidence, but nevertheless, I'll give you a chance to comment on some matters. Rural character as a concept is going to include things like the characteristics of rural settlements as they've evolved historically, isn't it?
Insofar as they are part of the wider landscape, yes, I would agree, in the same way as landscape character assessments often consider settlements as well. They're all part of the whole wider landscape.
But of course, they can be part of the rural character, shape of settlements, linear settlements, for instance, can be part of the rural character of an area through historical evolution without being part of the landscape character, can't they? Rural character is a broader concept than landscape character here.
I'm not sure I would completely agree that the two can be disassociated in that same way. Landscape character looks at all different scales, national level, county level, district level, and therefore encompasses historic factors. They often reference settlements and historic settlement patterns. So I don't think there's something that would be considered under rural character that's not considered as part of a wider landscape character assessment process.
Similar point, please, is in respect of settlement size. the size of a settlement is something that can be relevant to rural character. Again, without giving rise to any adverse L&V impacts, can't it?
Again, the size and scale of settlements within their wider landscape context is a relevant consideration for character, yes.
Moving on to the second of the S1 key concepts, please, which is the identity of individual settlements. Again, I don't for a moment suggest that landscape and visual issues are irrelevant to settlement identity, but they're not the only relevant considerations, are they? The identity of a settlement can be heavily informed by things like its size and shape. Yes?
Yeah, as I mentioned in chief, the size and shape is one component part in the same way as building styles are, and the surrounding landscape are all contribute towards identity of a settlement.
They all contribute towards identity. That's helpful, thank you. Factors such as size and shape and their impact per se, as it were, their impact as such without giving rise to landscape and visual issues, means, doesn't it, that a change to size or shape might be relevant to settlement identity without manifesting as a component in an LVIA. That's right, isn't it? Because the LVIA is answering a different question to settlement identity.
Yes, LVIA is looking at different aspects, and I think, as I've mentioned, size, shape, and scale, however it's termed, is a contributing factor to landscapes in the same way as it's a contributing factor to settlements.
And because they are conceptually different, is that the reason that the LVA doesn't mention S112? Because I checked it very carefully this morning, and there's no mention of Key Principle 12 as a policy informer that's identified specifically within your LVA.
I'm going to take it as fact that it's not referenced in there. We tend to, in terms of LVIA, obviously they're wide ranging documents and tend not to focus entirely on, not entirely, it's a part of the consideration, the policy aspects, but equally landscape character assessments, published landscape character assessments are another part of that.
Something else which isn't mentioned in your LVA, or indeed in your proof of evidence, is the characterisation assessment that we looked at with Mr. Coleman. Now, that's right, first of all, it's a matter of fact, isn't it?
It is, yes, it's not referenced within those documents, though.
No, and it is a material consideration for the inspector, isn't it? Because it informs, provides probably the most detailed historical descriptions we have about the rural settlement characters and the identities of the rural settlements that's before this inquiry.
It is something which assists in that, yes.
And in as far as it assists in it, it's not something you've considered in your written evidence or your LVA?
It's not referenced in there, but I was obviously aware of the document. And I noticed it's an evidence-based document, so it was reviewed, but it's not mentioned specifically, for example, under policy S1 as a key evidence-based document.
So you were aware of it, but you chose not to mention it?
It was reviewed, but it wasn't mentioned specifically in the LVA. There's lots of other documents that we will have reviewed and read, not necessarily mentioned specifically in the LVA.
Thank you. If the inspector takes the view, as I'm going to invite him to in closing, that the concepts of rural character and settlement identity are broader than the concepts of landscape and visual impact, I appreciate you've said what you've said on that. If the inspector prefers my reading of the policy, that they are broader concepts, then it would follow, doesn't it, that the absence of something like a formal landscape designation for the site is a matter of limited relevance, because landscape designations are concerned with landscape impacts. We're concerned with a different question of settlement identity.
So can I just go back to the first part of your question regarding suggesting a difference between the concept of rural character and landscape and visual impact assessment? So do you mean a difference between rural character and landscape character? I just wanted to clarify, or because obviously LVIA is a process, whereas rural character.
Yeah, you're
is a
absolutely
description.
right. That's a very fair point. Yes, like rural character, I'm going to say is different to landscape character in this context. Fair point.
Again, I would consider a landscape character assessment considers the rural character as a part of its baseline evidence gathering. It's a somewhat, it's a different term in many ways, as I understand, as I take it, for broadly the same thing. As I said earlier, rural character can be considered on a smaller scale in the same way as landscape character can, and could be considered on a larger scale as well.
Yeah, and I accept
one has to draw a, yeah.
I accept you say they're the same.
Yeah.
If the inspector thinks they're not the same,
Yeah.
and that rural character means something different to landscape character, then it will follow, wouldn't it, that the absence of landscape designations, for instance, is going to be of limited relevance because they're aimed at different targets.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Landscape designations and equally ecological designations, heritage designations, they all contribute to the character of an area, whether that be a very small area or a much larger area. To me, it's the same as how much they would contribute to the rural character. For example, if one was to take them as different things, as I think you're suggesting, I would still consider a landscape designation would contribute to someone considering the rural character, because landscape designations consider what one might call rural features. So I understand where you're coming from, that they could be considered different, but I still think a landscape designation would be equally relevant to considering landscape character or rural character, in my own view.
Now, I accept it's relevant. It's going to be less relevant if the concepts are different, though, isn't it? Because if landscape character means rural character.
If the concepts are different, there might be a difference in how much the designation contributes to that.
Yes, that's precisely my point.
But yeah, as I say, I would consider that they contribute equally to those two things if they were different.
Thank you. If we can just have a brief look, please, at policy S8, page 45. There's just one.
All right.
I appreciate you're not the witness to address policy questions too. I just want to note a brief point with you here, and that is that we've got the opening couple of lines, we've then got the classification of the settlement types, and then we have the text, the countryside will be protected for its landscape. You see that?
I do, yes.
And of course, what we see here is that landscape is protected, natural resources and ecological value, as well as intrinsic character and beauty. Do you see that?
I do.
So intrinsic character and beauty under this policy is something to be considered and protected independently of landscape impact, isn't it? Because if it was folded into landscape, there'd be no need to have said as well as.
I can see that they are separate. To me, I find that quite an unusual distinction between the two, and I would take from that landscape probably means more towards landscape fabric rather than character, but obviously I can't be sure on how that's being interpreted in this point, because ultimately landscape is landscape character, and to me that's the same as intrinsic character and beauty. They're wrapped into the same thing ultimately.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move on to some of the characteristics of Latchingdon, both on its own terms and as a settlement within the wider Dengie Peninsula typology, if I can put it that way. And for this, please, we're going to need the Malden Characterisation Assessment, which is core document 3.20, please. Let me know when you're there.
Yes, I'm there.
You
Yes, thank
have it.
Sorry.
Great. No, not at all. Now, you I think were here yesterday, Mr. Milcrease.
I was
so
indeed, yes.
I think you saw the reference to Latchingdon being an agricultural settlement.
Yes, I
we
did.
don't
One
need
of,
to go
one
into
of the
that, I
agricultural
take.
settlements covered by this
Fantastic.
document.
Well, in that case, we don't need to trouble ourselves with paragraph 3.4. We can agree that it is an agricultural settlement for these purposes. If we can start, please, on page PDF 55, which is where we get into the key characteristics of the agricultural settlements on the Dengie Peninsula.
6.0, yeah.
6.0, that's it. Agricultural settlements, key characteristics. And 6.1.1 begins by noting a number of characteristics, which I think are all consistent with what you said in chief, Mr. Milcreast, happily, that the villages are in areas of early open field enclosure, often have nucleated or linear forms that were well established by the late medieval period. See that?
I do.
Now, as a point that was made to Mr. Coleman yesterday as well, a village is either linear or it's nucleated, but the point here is that they are established by the late medieval period. That's the
Yes.
yes, that's the
What it
focus
states in
here.
6.1.1,
Yep.
yes.
Note some of them have moved from the original site, but in the majority of villages, the parish church is still the dominant architectural statement at the heart of the village.
Agreed, yes.
If we can go on to the next page, please. Oh, sorry, further down on the page, 6.1.4, we get into some description of the village core. And one of the features identified about village core within this is that it tends to be clustered around the roads. Most houses close to the road on the fourth line. Do you see
Yes,
that?
I do see that.
And that effectively is describing linear settlement typology.
Yeah, linear or ribbon, yes, indeed.
Or ribbon, yeah. I think we can hopefully agree those changes.
Yeah.
The terms are interchangeable
Indeed.
for these purposes. Thank you. And then on the next page, 6.1.5 tells us a little bit about what's happened more recently from the early 1900s onwards, so effectively in the last 100 years. And again, what's said here is consistent with what you said in chief, which is that we see the addition of things like cul-de-sacs of housing, which form equivalents of suburbs around those linear cores. Do you see all of that?
Yes, I do. Yes.
Excuse me. So what we have being described here, linear ribbon village core clustered along the road with a church at its centre and with later cul-de-sac developments spreading around it from the 1900s onwards, is very much Latchingdon, isn't it?
Yes, that's an accurate description, I'd say, yes.
It's an accurate description of Latchingdon. If we can go on, please, to page 65.
Sorry, 65 of the PDF or
It's
the...
PDF 65, yeah. Is anyone using the hard copy? Or we all?
just...
Electronic copy.
Great. If everyone's electronic, I can safely use the electronic numbers, I think.
Mine's not got a number. Can you just provide me with the section?
Yeah, it's 6.3 specific policies, it's headed.
Okay. Yes, I found that.
Do you have it?
I do.
And as with documents of this type, these aren't development plan policies. No one's suggesting that. What these are is effectively expressions of how to protect the key characteristics that have been identified earlier. Is that fair?
Yes, in terms of in terms of the context of this document. Yes.
In terms of the context of this document, absolutely. And the very first of those expressions we see is policy 6.1, and that identifies that the predominant linear form of the settlement should be maintained and closes and cul-de-sacs should be avoided. Do you see that?
I do.
This is in a context of a document which has already identified the delivery of closes and cul-de-sacs in the last 100 years, which may have weakened linear form, and yet nevertheless predominant linear form is to be maintained. Do you see?
I do.
It's also notable, isn't it, that of the linear and nucleated settlement types, which we saw at 6.1.1, it's the linear forms, not the nucleated ones, that are identified here for maintenance.
Yes, I believe that's what it said.
And the inference we can draw from that is that the authors of this document regarded the linear settlement form as more important to the agricultural rural character of the area than the nucleated ones, or it would be the other way around.
I don't remember it stating that specifically.
No, as I said, it's an inference, isn't it? The inference we draw, if they thought the nucleated forms were the important ones, policy 6.1 protect predominant nucleated settlements, but it doesn't. It protects linear ones.
But I think as we've seen going through this document and my evidence in chief, I take the view that we've kind of organically moved away from the purely linear, admittedly broadly linear, but we are still having those linear forms as described in here already contain nucleated form within them.
And the document recognises that, doesn't it? That's what we saw in 6.1.4 a little earlier, 6.1.5, forgive me, when it talks about the addition of cul-de-sacs in the last 100 years.
Yes, it acknowledges that those are part of the settlement.
They're part of the settlement. They're inevitably going to turn a strictly linear form into a broadly linear one if they move away from the road.
I would agree, yes.
And yet, in that context, the predominant linear form is nevertheless to be maintained.
Yes, that's effectively what this policy would be requesting, yes.
That's what this policy is requesting, yes. So when we are considering whether or not a further departure from the linear form is acceptable or not, we are to bear in mind that this document proceeds on the basis that it isn't acceptable. The linear form is to be maintained, notwithstanding that it may have been weakened in the last 100 years.
But assuming that nucleated forms currently form part of the broadly linear form, I wouldn't say it's excluding further nucleated form, because that could equally contribute to the broadly linear form. If it's done so in the past, I've no reason to see why it wouldn't be able to do so in the future.
Except, of course, that they want us to avoid things like closes and cul-de-sacs, don't they? That's what 6.1 tells us.
It does say that, but that in itself is slightly inconsistent with the characterisation within this document, which already concedes that cul-de-sacs and closes form part of the settlements that they are talking about.
So perhaps we can summarise then, that being so, the effect of 6.1 as being thus far and no further.
I'm not sure I would read it like that. Otherwise, I would presume it would say something along those lines specifically.
Well, it's not going to talk about demolishing existing cul-de-sacs, is it? That's not going to be something it says.
No, it wouldn't say that, but I stand by the point that if closes and cul-de-sacs can be acceptable in the current form, why could they not be considered acceptable in the right place?
And precisely because they continue to weaken linear forms which are already weakening, and further weakening would be unacceptable because of its impact on agricultural settlement character.
I disagree with the sentiment, but I understand what you're saying.
Thank you very much. With all of that in mind, can we take up, please, Mr. Coleman's proof, simply because he's got some plans side by side and it'll save us jumping around. We're going to need pages 18 and 19, please, sir, when we get there. Are you there, sir?
Yeah.
Great. There, Mr. Milchrist?
Yes, I'm there. Thank you.
Great. I'd like to begin, please, with the figure 4.22.3, which is the bottom of page 19, aerial view of contemporary Latchingdon. That is what's there now, in effect.
Yeah.
And this is what you've described as broadly linear.
Yes, indeed, yes.
Yes, and one can readily see why, can't they? The settlement, although it's stretched a little bit away from the roads, it is, as you say, broadly a linear structure following the road patterns in the area.
It's broadly linear with nucleated forms adjacent to what would be the more historic and more linear settlement. It's not specifically shown on this plan, but knowing the village, that yes, the core is effectively the original linear.
The core is quite so. And what we note, don't we, from 4.22.3 is that there's been, as one might put it, nucleated expansion to the north of the settlement, up above where we see the Red Line pub. We've had development pull out away from the road there.
Yes.
We've had development pulled out to the west of Burnham Road as it travels north through the settlement.
Yes.
But to the east of Burnham Road as it travels north through the settlement, the linearity is much more legible, isn't it?
I would consider those areas broadly nucleated, in the sense that they have divorced away from the central road. And just reflecting on a previous comment, obviously the characterisation document was produced in 2006. And if, as put to me, it would preclude further closes and cul-de-sacs. Clearly, there have been closes and cul-de-sacs, as we see on this plan, which is why I bring it up now, which have been agreed to be acceptable since the 2006 characterisation document. So I suppose the question put to me was, it's advising no more closes and cul-de-sacs. Actually, there has been quite a few, at least 3 areas of closes and cul-de-sacs which have been built since that point.
Well, we need to be a little bit careful there, Mr. Milcrease, because at the time that those were built, as we heard from Mr. Coleman yesterday, the tilted balance was engaged. Now, I appreciate that isn't your evidence, but one of the effects of the tilted balance is that it can cause development to receive permission, notwithstanding the sort of conflicts that things like S112 are designed to prevent. I appreciate that's not your evidence. I'm not going to push you on it, but I do note that so that we're all aware of the direction of travel. Okay?
Yeah, I'm unaware whether they were all approved under that status, but it's probably something for others to comment on.
Anything that was approved at a time when the tilted balance was engaged might have been approved notwithstanding this kind of adverse impact.
That would depend on the level of harm, obviously, as to whether the level of harm was considered to be overriding in the balance. But I take your point.
Thank you. I won't push you on that any further.
Okay,
You're not the planning witness. So that 4.22.3 gives us, as it were, the contemporary baseline. I think that one of the ways you've put it. We could see on the page before 4.22.1 the location of the proposed development, the development site. We can fairly easily understand how that's going to be located. If we were to superimpose it onto 4.22.3, we can see where the roads curve and where the field boundaries are.
Agreed.
And what is going to be apparent from that mental superimposition, as it were, comparing the two plans, is that the proposal is going to make the eastern extent of the settlement considerably more nucleated than it is at present, isn't it?
I would disagree with that on the basis that we are delivering a very wide, or proposing to deliver a very wide landscape buffer, which wouldn't contribute, if you like, to the figure ground in terms of built form and open space. There would be an addition to the nucleated form on that edge. I would agree. I wouldn't call it a significant addition to that.
Well, I don't for a moment suggest that the built form is going to go all the way up to the settlement boundary. That's your point about the soft edge, isn't it? But nevertheless, there is going to be development pulled east very much further than development currently tracks east in this part of the settlement, isn't there?
It's going to go further east. I would disagree that it's very much further, but that's perhaps the point between us.
That's the sort of point of judgment that I think we can safely leave to the inspector. To the extent that it's pulled east, every new house, every degree of extension eastwards weakens the linear form of the settlement.
I'm not entirely sure that that's true in terms of how you experience the settlement.
Well, we'll come on to
it. One doesn't typically experience on an everyday basis the linear form. One doesn't typically experience an aerial view of a settlement when considering the identity. One typically, in an everyday scenario, would experience that as they drive through, walk through, live in, experience a settlement. And my own opinion is, as you approach the changes that would accrue with the appeal proposals in place, would accrue for a short length, well, the change would be to a short length of Burnham Road, short length of Steeple Road, in terms of the experience of the settlement. As you then go past the appeal site on Burnham Road, you're into the existing settlement, and you don't then experience we wouldn't then experience the appeal proposals strongly in a visual sense. You'd be more focused on the immediate surroundings to that road, which is obviously the existing settlement context.
Now, you've gone to precisely where I was going to go next anyway, which is how it's experienced on approach. Can we begin with this, Mr. Milcreast? If we're talking about the experience of a linear settlement, any change in that experience is almost always going to be perceived as it's approached from the side, isn't it? As you're travelling along the length of the road which goes through the linear settlement, almost by definition, you're not going to experience a change.
Not necessarily. If I'll take a different landscape context, for example, if you were within a valley and you were driving along a valley road and the settlement was extending up the valley side, you would experience it in a different way. You would not only experience those parts of the settlement close to you, but you'd experience those potentially up the valley sides because they'd be more visible.
Of course,
and the flat landscape in this instance, to my mind, narrows the extent to which you would experience these proposals as you were travelling through the settlement. The other way you might experience is through green gaps, where you might see development beyond a green space or along a road. But yeah, I understand your point that the predominant experience would be of that settlement as you pass through it. I just don't think I don't think just because you would typically experience from a road means that it's inevitably you're not going to experience the new parts that are proposed.
No, but let's then think about that in the context of the Dengie Peninsula agricultural settlement specifically. Can we? I wasn't going to do this, but I think we need to. Can we just go back, please, to the characterisation assessment?
Yes.
3.20, I think. Hopefully, everyone's still got it open. 6.1.4, please, which was telling us about the village core, about the key linear part. Do you have it?
I do.
And we'll note 5 lines down, it's talking about, so it'll start from 3 lines down. Prior to the 19th century, village relatively compact, most houses close to the road, even fronted directly onto the back edge of the highway. Spaces between buildings were minimal, or they are attached in tight groups or rows. So the nature of the sort of village cores we're talking about in the Dengie Peninsula is such that green gap isn't going to be much of a consideration, is it?
I think that's talking predominantly about the historic fabric of the settlements rather than, if you want to call the nucleated additions since the original sort of birth of the village, if you like.
No, quite so, but we're talking here, aren't we, about the ability to perceive, precisely the ability to perceive those nucleated additions beyond the linear core. And it's a characteristic of the linear core that it lacks green gaps.
As set out here, yes, the linear core, yes, the heart of the village, if we want to call it that, at Latchingdon, near the roundabout and the church, yes, I would agree that that's an accurate description, yes.
That's an accurate description, and notwithstanding that accurate description of a lack of green gaps, Policy 6.1, as we've seen, still seeks to maintain linear form, right?
Yes, by fact, it does seek to maintain linear form. But I'd go back to what I said. I think it's the extent to which you can experience it and experience the change brought about by a development rather than simply looking at the historic core element.
Now, in your evidence in chief, you referred to a couple of the viewpoints, and it's the viewpoint from the Burnham Road to the east of the settlement that I want to ask you about. I think my point is is largely at the conceptual level, so we don't necessarily need it open. But it's
Viewpoint, viewpoint two.
Yeah, viewpoint two. You know the one I mean.
I do.
Yeah. So looking northwestward up towards
Yes,
the
agreed.
appeal site. Yeah. Now, it's in the nature of a viewpoint, isn't it, that it's a snapshot in space.
It is indeed, yes.
And it is in the nature of experience that it's not a snapshot in space. It is the travelling along the road that we're concerned with.
It's a sequential experience. Yes.
Sequential experience, a fair way of putting it, yeah. Now, you I think, fairly accepted in chief that from viewpoint 2, the development is going to appear closer to the viewer because development has been pulled eastwards along the Burnham Road. Yes?
Agreed, yes. It's a matter of fact, it will be closer.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that being so, it's also a matter of fact, isn't it, that as one travels westward along the Burnham Road, one is going to experience arriving at built form out of the right-hand window, as it were, to the north, sooner than one does at the moment, point 1, and 2, quite a way before one gets to the bend as Burnham Road turns north.
You will experience the whether you'll, I'm not actually sure you'll experience the development sooner. It will be closer to you as you travel westwards along that road. But as I mentioned in chief, if one moves further east along Burnham Road towards the sort of east of the Dengie Peninsula, there are houses, there are farmsteads, there are hedgerows by the road and within the fields immediately to the north of Burnham Road, which severely limit the ability to view the current settlement edge. I haven't done a precise test on how soon, or whether it's, I don't think you would experience it much sooner, if I'm entirely honest, but it would be certainly in the early stages of a greater scale in the view than it is currently, because it's closer.
Thank you. Last couple of questions for you, Mr. Milcreast. We're almost there. First of all, settlement size. You'll recall that some evidence was given by Mr. Coleman about the impact of the increase in the number of dwellings within the settlement, as it were. Not in landscape or visual terms, but in terms of settlement identity
Numbers,
and character. Yeah. That's not a point you've considered in your proof, is it?
Not specifically, no. The increase in numbers of dwellings, I haven't, no. I would.
No.
I don't know if we want to go there, but I would make reference to there's a very useful diagram within the design access statement showing the figure ground of the extent, if you like, of additional built form to the east. It's not a big point I want to make.
No,
So
I think we've seen from the various
Yes.
illustrative plans where the built form is going to be, at least in illustrative terms. So in that sense, I think we've got that point. I don't, as I say, don't suggest built form's going to go all the way to the edge of the settlement or anything like that. Final issue I'd like to address with you, please, is a point in your proof of evidence, 6.32, please. Paragraph 6.32, which we find on page 31. And it's bullet point 6. It begins using reference to historical maps. And here you describe the evolution of the settlement, if I can put it that way, and then say, albeit the appeal proposals will represent a larger scale proposal than other additions to the village, spatially speaking, the further extension of the town eastwards onto the appeal site I find to be consistent with the historic growth of the settlement and a natural next stage for growth of the village. And you use that as grounding your conclusion there'd be no impact on the village's identity. I just want to put this to you, Mr. Milcreast, and do tell me if this is one for Mr. Armstrong. The concept of settlement growth is not in any way a natural phenomenon, is it? It is a plan-led phenomenon in this country.
it is, yes.
It is. And so when one is considering what the next stage of development ought to be, one ought to be considering, at least as the starting point, where the development plan tells you development ought to go?
That is probably more of a question for Mr. Armstrong, and
Absolutely fine.
but I understand that. Would you like me to just go into a bit more detail about what I've written, or have you? Do you sorry.
No,
question.
I'm simply the simple point is this: however natural one may perceive an extension to be, the driver of the acceptability of an extension to a settlement is not whether it's a natural next step; it's whether it is in accordance with the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise, isn't it?
My take, in a sense, what I've written is from the context of a landscape professional who is looking at the character and context of Latchingdon, how it has grown and developed in the past, and how it might grow and develop in the future, were it thought that additional growth was required. So it's more of a landscape character and identity point, looking at the extent to which the development might or might not harm those aspects.
That's clear, thank you. Mr. Milcreast, I have no further questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. I've no particular questions to ask at this point. I asked you some questions earlier on. Mr. Cannock, do you have any re-examination?
Just a couple of points, sir, if I may. I'd like you to pick up the design and access statement, CD 1.7. And could you find within it, please, PDF, page 9 of 46.
What section is that, please, Mr. Cannock?
So section 6, page 9 of 46 on the PDF.
Consultation.
No, so it's the document, page 16, section 6, character analysis.
Okay,
Do you have that?
I do.
And so what we have here is this, so this is the application character analysis, and it's setting out at 6.1 an analysis of the existing built environment near the site, which is useful to provide inspiration and to, okay, whatever. And then at 6.2, it's talking about the urban form and the village expansion. Do you see that? And it's saying halfway through, so it's making reference to the landscape character assessments, that they're within the planned landscape known as Dengie form. This form is characterised by coaxial rectilinear field patterns. Roads have developed at the boundaries of the rectilinear fields, creating a network of right-angled roads and junctions around which linear settlements have formed. Seems to be some agreement between what's set out here and what Mr. Coleman was telling us yesterday. And it then says, while the origins of Latchingdon village followed the Burnham Road and the street, later additions to the village in the 1960s and more recently have developed in depth behind these main through roads, as illustrated at figure 8. And you then can see, and we can follow figure 8 below. And at 6.6, it's saying the main stages of significant village growth where new streets have been introduced occurred around the 1960s and 1980s. And whilst these newer additions do not follow historic field boundaries, they continue a rectilinear pattern within the wider field pattern, maintaining the general linearity of Latchingdon. The 1960s and 80s dwelling types are atypical of dwelling types built across the country. They take little character reference from the historic or Essex vernacular. Okay, so pausing there, because you were asked some questions. I'll come to the precise question of clarification in a moment. But what is the apogee, the apotheosis, the classic form of linear development?
The class, as I understand it, I'm not a complete expert, but I would say it's single-sided along roads. Hence the term ribbon development is also used.
Ribbon, right, okay. And if I look at the dark red, the areas up to 1895, how, if at all, would the settlement pattern comply with that apogee of linearity?
It's precisely what you would expect, single-sided with historic buildings on the junctions of the roads.
Next, please, you were taken to CD 320. So CD 320, which is the characterization study, and paragraph 6.1.5. Is this an analysis of Latchingdon per se?
No, this is an analysis of the agricultural villages as they're set out in this document.
But it says, from the early 1900s, groups of council houses were often added to the fringes of the villages, and these with villas, bungalows, and then the later, my learned friend Mr. Goatley would pronounce this cul-de-sac, but cul-de-sacs of both local authority and speculative housing constitute the equivalent of suburbs. Yeah. So how consistent is that generic proposition with the precise analysis we have of Latchingdon? What's the level of consistency?
It's almost exactly the same, really. You have a historic linear form from the 1800s, which has then been added to, as I explained in my evidence, in a number of different areas over the last 100 or so years.
Right. So if we're trying to understand as a starting point what is the identity of Latchingdon, what, if any, consistency or inconsistency is there between this generic assessment and the specific assessment we have in the DAS?
It's very similar.
Okay. So then the next point then is 6.3. And what we have is what is called a specific policy. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, is this characterization assessment referred to as an evidence document supporting policy S1?
No, it is not. It's not listed as a key document.
Is it a document to which we should have reference in interpreting and applying policy S1? Is it referred to?
Not specifically, but it's not referred to.
Right. You might want to defer this to Mr. Armstrong, but respectfully, it's fairly simple. What weight should we attach to this as a policy?
Given it's part of an evidence base, it's not related to that specific policy, and it's of some age now, limited weight, I would argue.
Right.
But it's more of a planning.
And what it's saying is, as a matter of policy, that closes and cul-de-sacs should be avoided. Is there any national or local policy or national or local design guidance which supports the proposition that closes and cul-de-sacs should be avoided?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Right. So I want to understand this then. If we were to follow this policy and we were to have linear forms of settlements, how would Latchingdon expand?
Unfortunately, in the same way that many other settlements would have to expand, and that would be as ribbon development along roads.
Right.
Because of if there's no other way of providing numbers of housing, then that's our only option.
So it supports, the logic is we have linear development going out either side along Burnham Road. How consistent is that with national policy's requirement for walkable neighbourhoods?
Not at all, or the effective use of land.
Well, that was the next point, the effective use of land. Right. Where, if anywhere, can you point to some national design guidance or landscape guidance which supports the proposition that settlements should expand in this ribbon-like linearity form?
Simply, there is none. It's not really a viable in terms of not using cars, or from an urban design perspective, it's really unconscionable, really.
And my learned friend was asking you about scale. And you're saying, well, you experience the scale as you're moving along the roads. If you were to expand settlements so that it's ribbon development along Burnham Road, for example, would that have a greater or lesser impact on one's experience of the scale of Latchingdon than what is proposed, which is compliance with the rectilinear field patterns?
Well, evidently, it would have the effect of making any linear settlement appear larger than it was. You're extending your experience of the settlement over a much greater degree than you would, for example, if you were to put 160 houses along the roads in a single-sided or ribbon development form. It would make Latchingdon appear significantly larger.
Thank you, sir. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cannock. I've no further questions, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think it might be an appropriate time to have a break now. It's 12:15, and we can then hear the evidence of
In one piece.
in one piece in the afternoon. How long did? Just to recap, you said about 45 minutes.
Yes, so I'm going to address. Do you recall you had a couple of points about the application? Just to inform this, and perhaps if you get a second to look at it over lunch, statement of common ground at 3.8 and core document 1.27. I think that addresses the point that you've raised, and so my learned friend knows. Oh right. Oh well. Then, as always, so he's one step ahead of me. But if you were to just have a look, then you'll understand Mr. Armstrong's answers. Okay.
Thank you very much. Good. All right. Well, we'll take an hour today for lunch. What would be helpful as well is if I could be supplied during the break with, if it's possible, with paper copies of the conditions and the obligation, if that's possible. Thank you very much. So we'll resume then at 1:15. Thank you. Thank you very much.